The session will be moderated by Raza Rumi, who is a prominent writer and commentator from Lahore. He's a regular contributor to the Friday Times, the News, Dawn, on topics like history, politics, and literature. He's the editor of Cyber magazine, Park Tea House, and Lahore Nama. He is also a self-taught painter, and he's trained as a social development lawyer and a public administration. So over to you, Raza.
Many thanks, Sumer. I think that introduction was a bit too much, but anyway. Well, thank you all for being here, and I think that this is a very interesting session. Earlier, when I looked at the way it was formulated, it made me a bit nervous because there were 7 panelists, and there's only 1 hour, and luckily or unluckily, some could not come. So we have more room for some flexibility. But the way I'd like to go about it is that, towards the end, I'd like maximum time for an interactive session with the speakers here, so that their questions and comments which they can address rather than me asking them too many questions, because that's been a regular problem with the sessions here that I have attended, at least, that the time at the end runs out. So, without much delay, I'd like to introduce our panelists. On this side is, let me get the exact name. My apologies for that. Is Mr. Hartosh Bal Singh, who is a sorry.
I'll introduce myself. So many dropouts and things. My name is Kishore Bhimani. I'm a journalist and lover of Pakistan. Keep coming here for
Let me. Mr. Bhimani is being humble about himself. He has 44 years of journalistic experience, has just authored a novel, and is a frequent traveler to Pakistan. He was for a long time associated with the Statesman from Calcutta. And on my and Mr. Anatol Lieven needs.
Miss out the lover of Pakistan.
The lover of Pakistan, yes, indeed. And Mr. Lieven, Anatol Lieven is it needs no introduction. He was in many sessions yesterday, and his recent book, Pakistan, a Hard Country, is a much debated and discussed book on Pakistan. He has been a journalist for a very long time, has also worked in Pakistan, has covered some of the most interesting topics, and has also reported on Karachi at length. Declan Walsh on my right, again needs no introduction. Declan, as a friend remarked this morning, can hardly be called a foreigner anymore because he's been here for too long. And so that way, Declan has been with The Guardian for at least 7 years, if I'm not wrong. And this year he has moved to the New York Times, and he's the Pakistan sort of in charge for NYT. And of course, we are very lucky to have Mr. Alok Bhalla from Delhi as well, who is also a writer and an eminent one at that, and a commentator, a translator, and a well-known literary figure in our neighbor. And our last guest, Mr. Let me find the introduction. I'm sorry, Stefan. Weidner, yeah. Anyway, Stefan Weidner is a German writer, journalist, and a translator. He is a scholar of German and philosophy and Islamic studies, and has been the chief editor of the journal, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, Fikrun of Wafan, published by the Goethe Institute, which sees its purpose as mediating between Western and Islamic worlds. Well, anyway, we'll get to Mr. Weidner and ask him more questions, but I'd just like to begin by saying that Pakistan, for some right and for some wrong reasons, has been in the global spotlight for at least a decade or over a decade now. And of course, the whole idea of imagining Pakistan and writing about Pakistan as a foreigner is a much contentious process by itself. We in Pakistan, of course, have a lot of grievances against those who report on us and often complain that why is one side of Pakistan more highlighted than the many facets multifaceted sides of Pakistan, a country of 183 million, of course, cannot be labeled or bracketed just by a bunch of extremists or by some explosions or what happens in particular parts of Pakistan. Well, that's one side. On the other side is that, we also get a kind of perspective from those who are reporting on Pakistan and analyzing Pakistan, and perhaps seeing us in a more detached manner, and how detached or attached their narratives are to the reality of Pakistan is perhaps a moot point and a question which we'll try and explore. I think the second issue that also comes to my mind, and Faiza Khan, my friend, I don't know whether she's here or not, but she reminded me that often when we complain about foreigners writing about Pakistan, but some of us in Pakistani sort of English-speaking circles are perhaps even as detached from the real Pakistan as they are. So really, how do you draw these boundaries, and how do you actually come to some clarity on the eyewitnesses and observer accounts on Pakistan? So I think without going too much into detail, I'd like Anatol Levin to begin this talk and perhaps take about 5 to 6 minutes and say what you have to.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to go first. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Maybe I'll put this on a box. Something that struck me very much reporting in Pakistan over the years is the extraordinary contrast between the way often that you spend your days and you spend your evenings. Now, I suppose that's quite true of life in general, but it seems it's more so if you're a journalist in Pakistan, because of course, especially given the kind of things that the media, the Western media as well, are interested in, but also given some of the realities of Pakistan, you can spend your days reporting some very nasty things and seeing some very nasty sights, and indeed meeting some very nasty people on occasions. However, then in the evening, in other countries where you're on assignment, you'll go back to your hotel, and you have drinks with your other Western colleagues who are around, and so forth. I've always said, to do that in Pakistan, you have to be very busy, very tired, very ill, or very, very antisocial. Because the far greater likelihood is that you will have 1, 2, 3 invitations to dinner, to parties, or just to hang out with old friends. Because Pakistan is in that way such a hospitable and warm country. And that is perhaps, in the end, what makes many of us keep coming back here, even given that some of the stories we're covering can be very depressing. Especially, not that this is a story that the West is particularly interested in, but if you've been covering Pakistan for 25 years on and off, you've been covering electricity shortages for 25 years on and off. The other thing I find about reporting Pakistan compared to other places is that by the same token, people can be amazingly frank. People in positions of authority off the record. Sorry, these microphones are terrible. Can you hear me now? I'll just hold it up to and lean forward. And that is often, of course, the case, because you will go somewhere and you'll meet the DC or the DIG or SSP or whoever, and he will turn out to be the brother or the uncle or the nephew of someone who you've just had dinner with in Lahore or Karachi. And then, of course, a bond of trust is created. And he will, be extraordinarily frank about some of the realities of what he does and Pakistani life. That, by the way, creates an even greater obligation on the journalist not to betray confidences. Certainly you can write about this, but not to write about them by name, and also, of course, not to criticise the hosts with whom you've been staying. There are a couple of dangers about this. probably don't need to tell you that you shouldn't necessarily believe everything that you hear at parties in Pakistan, especially the later the evening gets, including when they come occasionally from people who apparently are highly well informed and so on. So you need a certain amount of caution. The other thing perhaps is that in Pakistan you do need to be particularly careful as a journalist not to be captured in a way by the people you spend time with. Because of course there is a natural affinity between, you know, Westerners, Western journalists and certain sections of Pakistani society. It would be an exaggeration to say that many Western journalists, at least on short-term assignments, when they go to Lahore, meet the same four Lahori intellectuals around the same coffee table, because actually there are 6 of them. It's a very nice coffee table. It's a beautiful coffee table, and I have a deep affection and admiration for many of the 6 people around it, but you do need to get out and about a bit more, and it is very necessary, you know, to get out into society and meet other people. And if you do, of course, you find that they too, I mean, right down to the lowest levels of society, you can say. Well, perhaps not the very lowest, but, you know, I've spent considerable periods in Pakistan when I've been doing vox pops on the street, you know, being offered cups of tea and Pepsi by scooter drivers, you know, and so forth. That makes doing vox pops in Pakistan, what in Britain, you know, informal opinion surveys, very pleasant. And even people who, well, not, of course, in northern Waziristan, I haven't done that for a while, but even people who express very strong anti-Western opinions will often accompany that with statements that, of course, that isn't directed against you, and, you know, you are our guest, and please sit down, and we will bring you a cup of tea. So, a very nice nice place to work. However, of course, the problem then becomes getting this through your editor in London. And of course, you know, today the theme is Taliban, Taliban, Taliban. You know, when I was here in the 80s, there were other themes. I mean, this is not particular to Pakistan, but perhaps because Pakistan tends to be, it's particularly extreme in the case of Pakistan. There is a particular tendency to simplify in the West. And Pakistani society is actually particularly complex. And so this tension, this trying to get through this editorial barrier is particularly strong. Now, this isn't just true of journalism. Perhaps, do I have time to end with one anecdote? Just one. I'm a journalist, and I'm only given one anecdote. It's awful. One anecdote. My book on Pakistan was commissioned by Penguin in London, and they then sold it on to an American publisher. The American publisher were told this was going to be a book about Pakistan in general, you know, yes, against the background of the rise of militancy, but it wasn't going to be all about extremism and the Taliban. Wrote the book, Penguin loved it, handed it over to the American publisher, and they came back to me on the phone and they said, well, Anatol, you know, we thought there was going to be more about the Taliban. For example, they said, you have this whole chapter on this province, what's it called, this province called Sindh? And then you say that the Taliban have as much chance of taking power in Sindh as you do. So why do you spend so much time on Sindh? Wouldn't it be a better idea if you folded your Sindh chapter into your Punjab chapter? I said to them, you go to Karachi the next time. Thank you. Sorry. I should make clear that publisher rejected the manuscript for that reason, and we then found an excellent American publisher, Public Affairs, who did publish the book.
Okay, I'll ask Declan Walsh to take the mic next.
Can you hear me okay? Thank you all for having me. I'm very pleased to be here in such eminent company with all of these great writers and one of Lahore's top 6 intellectuals. I have to say, first off the bat, I was slightly wary of the premise of this talk in the first place, partly because I've been here, as some of you know, for about 7, 8 years now. And this issue of, how foreigners see Pakistan is something that comes up over and over again. And I've been asked, I can't tell you how many times, to appear on television stations in particular to talk about this. And it often comes down to the same sort of questions about, is Pakistan as dangerous as you thought it would be before? Do you feel dangerous driving around F8 in Islamabad where you live? All of this sort of stuff. So I've been slightly wary of it, but that said, I understand that it's an important question for a lot of people. I think in many ways that's understandable for the reasons that Anatole laid out. Obviously, a lot of the news that comes out of Pakistan is very dark, concerned with Taliban and bombings and political crisis. I have to note, of course, these are the same things that are on the front page of the Pakistani papers, but I can see why this is something that preoccupies people very much. On the other hand, I do think, I think if you, kind of goes obviously to the heart of this idea about the representation of Pakistan, how it's seen abroad. Sometimes I think people's preoccupation with it is slightly exaggerated or out of perspective. It's often very telling for me when I leave Pakistan, which of course occupies 24 hours of my life while I'm here all the time, and I go back to the UK, or I go back to home. I'm from Ireland, and you realise that actually, while people here sometimes give you the impression they think that the entire world is conspiring about Pakistan all the time and is, obsessed with everything that happens here, actually that's not often the case. So for the criticism against journalists who operate here, I accept a lot of it in good faith. I think that, you can't hear me. I said, It's okay, I'll use this one.
Umair, can we get a mic, please? The other one?
Sorry, I'll just lean in. No problem. No, that's fine, I've got this one. So, sometimes foreign journalists who are here, we compensate for these criticisms by focusing on what's often described as the other Pakistan. So you'll see stories about many different things, about the famed hospitality of Pakistanis, which of course is, without question. You'll see stories. Can you hear this? Yeah. Okay. You'll see stories about one of my favourites that everyone has covered is a Murray Brewery. Shock horror in Pakistan, they brew beer and they actually drink quite a lot of it as well. You'll sometimes see foreigners overcompensating perhaps on this. There's a lot of comment about the coverage, for instance, of the regular fashion shows here in Karachi. The description of fashion shows as being a vehicle for the fight against the Taliban. I'm particularly fond of a website that some friends have set up called Fashionistas Against Taliban. I would highly recommend that any of you want to subscribe to it. I have to admit, I've done many, in my own work, apart from writing about bombs and bloodshed and chaos, I've also tried to cover a lot of these stories, everything from polo festivals in Chitral to the plight or what's happening with the Hijra community. And there's often a tendency for us foreigners to choose things that are counterintuitive because, when you've been here for a while, you understand what people are saying to you and you also want to show this famous other Pakistan. I suppose in my own case, coming here, I've been working, as Reza said, for The Guardian for many years. I've now changed to The New York Times. But I actually come from Ireland. And I think as an Irish person coming here, there's a couple of differences, I suppose. One is that when I was growing up, I actually knew very little about Pakistan or India because it wasn't part of our sort of cultural induction, if you like, in the same way it might be for someone from Britain, where stories about Kim and these sort of things are much more present. I suppose I also didn't bring with me, to some degree, a little bit of the colonial baggage, I guess, that is, or the perceived colonial baggage that comes here. People sometimes in interviews will start upbraiding me about American or British policy, and my, slightly cheap trick is to say, well, actually, I'm neither. And of course, as an Irish person, I suppose we have a lot in common with Pakistanis. We were also obviously a colonized country. It's also a country which underwent a very painful partition, slightly earlier than Pakistan. So I suppose I like to think that, that helps in my sort of approach to the place. But I suppose at the end of the day, I do work for, what's known as the Western media. foreign journalists here are very much at the interface between, Western, more economically advanced societies, which do have a great influence obviously on what goes on here. And so I suppose we do play, an important role in informing perceptions on both sides. But at the end of the day, I suppose I would say two things. Number one, we are very much influenced by what appears in the Pakistani media. So sometimes the people, obviously, the headlines are about the turbulence and the violence and so on. But we also take our cues very much from the other stories, because journalists who are here, do get inspired by a Pakistani story about that good news phenomenon or that other thing. So I would just point out that what appears in the local press does have an influence on us. And secondly, to be perfectly honest, when you're writing a story about Pakistan, at the end of the day, when you put aside all of this, it's that simple, slightly lonely exercise of looking at a word processor, having a deadline in front of you 2 hours ahead, and you've got to turn out 800 words, and you're trying to make sense of very complex, fast-moving events. And it is, I suppose, at the end of the day, an exercise in intellectual honesty. You're trying to reflect in a straightforward manner as possible for a foreign audience, and don't forget it is for a foreign audience, what's been going on that day or that week. One of the lady in the audience here mentioned something about being a lover of Pakistan. For the time that I've been here, I suppose I've certainly become very fond of Pakistan, but I don't see it as the job of the foreign reporter to either love or hate Pakistan. I think our job is just to represent as clearly and as simply as we can.
Excellent. Thanks, Declan. That was very insightful. And just to make sure we stay within the limits of the time, I'll go to Mr. Alok Bhalla. And perhaps the point, because you are not a full-time journalist, and just taking a sort of different angle on the how Pakistan is portrayed in your country, and particularly in the press, and the kind of perceptions that are very commonly understood.
Thank you. I've been code shifting since morning. I've been overworked here, but I'm glad to see that I'm not a foreign reporter. Indeed, I noticed that in the references made thus far, there are 2 foreign reporters or 3, and they all report to foreigners. I have not been made to feel like a foreigner since I've come here, and so my perceptions of what I want to say is not dependent upon somebody who sees myself as an outsider. I've been more than welcome here. My only concern is that I wish I could be more welcome if only we could give up our visa regimes. That would really help. I think I also feel a kinship apart from the fact that I see the same 4 intellectuals in Lahore as he has. I have obviously therefore had conversations with them again and again. I also think that there is a commonality of the same riots, the same bombings, the same honor killings, the same misery in some ways, and that we have to work together to try to overcome this, all of this in our region. I think the common person's perception, I'm not a journalist at all, is in the Indian media certainly, I think, schizophrenic as far as Pakistan goes. It's both schizophrenic and it's hysterical. And it becomes more schizophrenic and hysterical when unfortunate events like Bombay happen. At that point, then a whole range of chauvinist expressions begin to dominate the media. But I'm glad to say that they soon die down. And by and large, saner voices take over. And the saner voices are all the time concerned with trying to create relations with Pakistan. I think if you talk to ordinary Indians by and large, and I consider myself a very ordinary Indian who is not involved in the government, the general tendency, the general hope, the general desire is to say to people, let's sit down and talk, let the politicians talk it out, and let's get on with our lives. All of us together, we have the same interests, and that we have the same problems. I think at the moment, this is what I really want to say. Thank you.
maybe we can go to Stefan Weidner and you can use this. This may be better.
Okay, thanks a lot. First of all, I have to admit that I'm the least qualified on this panel because I've never written on Pakistan. And the longer I'm here, the less I intend to do so. Although I've done a lot of travel writing. This is why I would like to leave as much as time as possible to the other panelists, just telling you that I feel the more I see of the country, I cannot say the more I get to know, because I don't know if this is kind of a knowledge, it's just of what I see and what I hear. The more I see and the more I hear, the more complex it seems to me, and the less accessible in a common, normal, journalistic way. And I'm very glad that I'm not forced to write about Pakistan as a journalist, although it is a thankful country for journalists, because you find so many things to report about, but still, there's so many things, the more you find to talk about, the more you leave out. And this complexity is would give me a headache, I think. And although I like the complexity, I mean, this is a fascinating thing. Being here is like being on a globalized spaceship of literature. This could happen anywhere. This could happen in Berlin. It could happen in New York, in London, in Paris, in Sarajevo, anywhere. But I came here with the train, with the Karachi Express from Lahore. And this was completely different, of course. I had a delay of only 3 hours, and I was told that I was very lucky. Usually it has something like 10 hours. I don't know, I was lucky. But this train journey is just the measure of the gap, which is a gap in this country itself. Well, this is the only thing I can say. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. And finally, I'll ask Mr. Ashokji to...
Kishore Vimani. Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, may I clarify an issue just mentioned by Declan? I said I came as a lover of Pakistan, not in my capacity as a journalist. I have never been to Pakistan as a political journalist, and the odd occasion that I did do a story that had a little bit to do with politics, the gentleman concerned who was supposed to send it in telex form in the old days, teleprinter, put me right and said, you are here as an invited commentator of the PTV or whatever the organization happens to be, and it's not your job to write on politics. It's very interesting. Apart from people like Declan, people like Mr. Weidner and other people, Anatol, we have a strange relationship. I've come here, I've felt welcome, everything is fine, but if I were here as a journalist, as an Indian journalist in Pakistan, everything metamorphoses. There's a chameleon-like quality. I am forced to report in a certain manner. I have to bear in mind my audience, I have to bear in mind sensitivities, and I have to bear in mind the truth. The fact is, coming now to this visit, which is my 13th or 14th visit to Pakistan over the last 30 years, I had some people had come over to say, well, they would like us to bring some nice mementos from Pakistan. And at the end of the evening, what is normal is for the visitor to say, have a nice trip. Have a great trip to Pakistan. These people were leaving, my wife who's sitting here and I, we were there and waiting. No great wishes for a great trip. And one of them turned around and said, I hope you come back. Now, why this perception? We are talking about perception. This perception has been encouraged by the media, sometimes vastly exaggerated, sometimes perhaps with some reason, but those of you who have access to seeing, nobody has mentioned thus far, which I can with great confidence, the electronic media in India, for which I am a guest speaker 2 or 3 times a week. We shall not mention the channels. We shall not mention the individuals on the channels, but they are all known to you. every 3 days or 4 days, there are a couple of Pakistani generals on the channel. And the conversation goes like this. General so-and-so, your country has again done it. Sir, what, will you give me a chance to speak? No, what you have done is not right. This is absolutely ridiculous. So he said, have you called me here to answer your questions? Anyway, I'll ask the other general who's on the panel, who has been involved with ISI and so on and so forth. What do you think of this horrible attitude of your country? And he says, well, I want to say, see, you have always making excuses. Now, what happens is, this is my own country, but I believe that there's a certain fairness. We have 5 people from different countries. Well, that's some from different countries, and people like Anatol is a superb journalist. Mr. Widener, I heard this morning and I was enthralled. I was only sorry that he had finished so early on this, the Arab Spring. We have a certain responsibility. When you are on electronic media, the electronic media reaches people straight into the heart. You want to create emotion, जज्बात है, आपको तैयारी करनी है ना, तो वो जज्बात तो electronic channels है. You can see the look on man's face. These 3 were killed there. They were a very interesting story, which I can say, some perhaps to the detriment of my own self, my own channel, was that, do you realize that on the border, on the LOC, 1 person was killed, this happened, that kind of shooting, our brave Jawans did this, so and so, so and so, so and so happened. 1 minute later, 29 people have died in rioting in other different parts of the country. Now, this is unfortunately the kind of thing that I wish would stop. We have differences, there are fundamental differences between the 2 countries, which we have to accept. I'm not saying that we all sit together, have a glass of pomegranate juice and sort it all out. It will not be sorted out like that, but at least we can be civilized about it. And I believe, I remember the perceptions are so different. I'll just take 1 more minute. The perceptions are so different. 1971 war, when I had just joined the paper, I had the privilege of meeting some of the finest journalists in the world. There was Mr. Baldur Bokov from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. There was Sidney Schanberg from the Washington Post. There was Dan Coggin from Time. There was Peter Jennings of the ABC television. There are 6 or 7 others. I speak Bengali, and I could communicate, and I would suddenly find myself very popular with these visitors. That would you come with us to the border, so that we could talk and I could do the translating. The fact was, the gentleman from Faz, who was a fine journalist, if a bit controversial, he wanted to know about the 3 countries. I said, wait a minute. There are 2 countries, as it was then. There's 1 country having some problems. There's a second country which is getting involved in it. Whatever, good, bad or indifferent, I'm not going to mention. But the point was, the top-class journalists had come here not fully aware of what this was all about. What was the history of this? Therefore, they talk of massacres and Pakistan and this and that, where they would be put right by the journalists that this is the background, these are the facts, these are the exaggerations, and whatever it is, then you report, then you comment on it editorially, etc. This is what happens time and again. Today, when the gentlemen who were the people who came to see me at my home when I was leaving, also expected that Karachi streets would be lined with sharpshooters up there and that we'd be dodging through bullets, and as such it would be very difficult for us to come back. And in fact, I think the lady concerned even forgot to ask that to give us the color of the sari, of the salwar she wanted or whatever it was, because I think deep down they thought this was a farewell visit. Now, somewhere along the line this is there, and Razat, sorry to take up so much time, this was basically what I wanted to say, that the perception of us as writers has got, say Indian journalists, has got to be totally different from the perception of the others. For the simple reason, first of all, as Mr. Bhalla he mentioned how it is that we are not made to feel like foreigners. We speak perhaps a bit of the same language. I try anyway, not very successfully, but otherwise the food is similar. Or there are a lot of things which are similar there. Similarity does not necessarily mean that we are the same people. Its similarity does not necessarily mean why are we fighting if we are so similar. There's so many people in the world. There's so many countries. Anyway, My only last comment is that I remember going back to Sidney Shandberg, my favorite journalist at the time, when he said, I told him, why do you want to go to the border? It was a rainy day, thunder, lightning, the road dug up. And I said, Sidney, do you really want to go to the Betai border to see what is happening? He said, you know, years later he would tell me that the Cambodian war was covered 70% from Bangkok. And Bangkok can be a very attractive place. And most of the so-called interviews with Pol Pot and Tamok and Ieng Sari were conducted in the imagination of people from Bangkok. And he said, I wish this doesn't happen in these things. And that is, unfortunately, if I wanted to cover Pakistan, what I would probably do that sitting in Delhi and talking to the kind of intellectual gentlemen we are talking about. But thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Bhimani. I think I'm very tempted to react to some of the things that have been said, but I think we must move on to the Q&A session. So, okay, there's one, okay, 2, 3, 4, okay. Let's start right at the end. Nabil? Yeah. Please keep it, if it's a comment, keep it very short. If it's a question, very specific.
It's a very short point.
Yeah.
I wanted to just applaud the bravery of the last gentleman who spoke. It takes a lot of courage to say what you said, because I have had occasion to visit India about 20 times, and on one occasion I spent up to 6 months there. And when I was sitting to breakfast for the 6-month period that I was there, I would read 3 or 4 newspapers, and every single day, without fail, this is in the mid-90s, the front page had a negative story on Pakistan. All 3 papers that I read. If you spend 6 months in Pakistan and you read the front page of the major dailies, you will not find an obsessive sort of negative story on India for 6 months at a stretch, I can assure you. So I'm delighted that you made the point that you did, and I applaud your courage again. Thank you.
Pass on the mic here. There's a question. Aage aaiye, please. Aage idhar. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I think I want to ask a question about Professor Levin's point. And it seems that knowledge about Pakistan, representations about Pakistan are now being brokered by a particular class of people in Pakistan, right? They write in magazines. They're connected to journalists, foreign journalists. So a lot of what gets known about Pakistan, as much as we complain, happens mediated through a certain class of people. And Professor Levin said we need to get beyond these relationships, these parties that we hang out with. But that's, I think, and this is, I guess, partly directed to Declan and Professor Levin. How do you do that? I mean, there's obviously some limits. There are time restraints in the production of the news. If you could just say a few words about how you actually go about getting beyond this brokering process with the elite class that you have a affinity with.
Okay.
Want to go first, Declan? No, go ahead.
Shall we take 3 questions and then perhaps get a response? So one more, please. Somebody raised the hand here. Oh, okay. Behind the pillar. I'm sorry, I can't see, but in a bit. Let Hussain ask his question.
There is this rite of passage amongst foreign journalists to write about the Murray Brewery. There's also a piece that inevitably comes out about attending a function at a drawing room in Islamabad, and then making the point, but this is not the real Pakistan. To my mind, I mean, there is no other Pakistan. There's not such a binary. There are many Pakistans. The middle class in Lahore is very different from the middle class in Karachi. The urban middle class is very different from the rural middle class. So Declan, when you are negotiating with your editor, do you try to force him to write about, say, the folk Islam that celebrates Urses and Sevan. Pakistan is very different from Karachi than it is from Islamabad. You look at things in a very different way here than you do privy to the machinations of the drawing rooms in Islamabad.
Okay, one more question from the side. Thanks.
Thank you. My question is directed towards Dr. Widener. You mentioned that you write travel writings as well. Violence has become the sine qua non of the Pakistani narrative, but the spring of that violence is the northern area, and paradoxically that is also home to one of the most beautiful places in the world, where there is a lot of Western travelers coming and seeing, and there are some very extraordinary stories of hospitality that do come from there, but you don't read them in the popular media. You can read blogs or specifically travel blogs. That is also a part of Pakistan, and which also affects the West. So how come that is never covered? That is never seen in the media.
Okay, there was somebody behind the pillar whom I've missed. Yeah. I'll come to you. Pillar के पीछे जो हैं उनको दीजिए. Nino, please आप बताइए.
Just one point. As Hamida Riaz said, तुम भी हम जैसे निकले. The Indians or Pakistanis can be equally wicked when it comes to that. Anita Joshua of the Hindu and Abdul something, a Muslim from South India of the PTI, Press Trust of India, were denied the permission to come to Karachi. They based in Islamabad, they were denied the permission to come to Karachi for 2 days to cover the Karachi Literature Festival. And I think it is on both sides, unfortunately.
ये माइक इनको पास कर दीजिए जरा. I'll come to you. Please let me go sequentially. First come, first serve basis.
Why don't we answer some of the questions?
Let me just five.
Okay.
And then.
This is not a question, this is just, I suppose, a query and curiosity. After 25 years, Professor Leven, why is Pakistan not pronounced in the correct way? It's very easy. It's A-R, mass, art, add F in front of art. You know, it's so easy.
Okay. I think let's take some responses now after this round. So, Anton, why don't you start? Take this.
Yes. Briefly, the point is, of course, not that Western journalists report from the coffee table, but it's more that when it comes to framing everything, you know, where they get their intellectual analysis of the society from, it can be a fairly narrow group and set of opinions. And by the way, that's by no means just true of Pakistan. I found it to be very true of Russia as well, and a number of places whose society as who have a westernized elite, at least part of its elite is westernized, but a mass of the population which is rather different. It can create this phenomenon of talking, you know, not just talking to a limited number of people, but of getting your frame of the society from those people. I call it, if you'll forgive the phrase, the copulation of illusions, because it's not that there's any intention to deceive on this side, it's just how people see their society, and naturally that's how they put it to the West, and the Westerners tend to see it in the same terms. And so you can get a picture of a country which sort of bounces to and fro without ever actually, or not often, touching the ground of reality. What to do? Well, I mean, yes, it is a problem. I must candidly say, for example, that I haven't been to many pleasant evening parties thrown by the Jamaat Islami or the JUI. You don't meet, if I were, I doubt that I would meet so many charming women at those parties. So naturally you spend your time hanging out, you know. That's what makes it important, I think, to do two things. The first is, I think, particularly important in this this part of the world is what in British journalism we somewhat pretentiously call vox pops, from vox populi, vox dei, when you go out onto the street with a recorder or a notebook, a translator, and just talk to a range of random people in different parts of town or villages and listen at length to what they have to say about their opinions, why they hold those opinions, who they support, and so forth, to get that range. The other thing is, I think, as an intellectual exercise, and I say that's not just true of journalists, my God, it's true of professors as well, and policymakers and everybody else, but as an intellectual exercise, every now and again, to consciously sit down, at least for a few minutes, and try to put yourselves in the shoes of very different people. Try to understand how they see the world. And not just how they see the world, but what their interest, why they see the world in that way, and what their real interests are. Now, of course, it's not at all easy, and I'm not saying that you like those shoes or you like, the persona that for those minutes you have to adopt, but I think it's extremely important, if you are to understand or to try to understand, not to understand, forgive me, to begin to understand, because I would entirely agree that after so long, I am only at most beginning to understand this place. Thank you.
On this issue about the westernized elite, this is something I've also been confronted with many times, most recently in the presence of Imran Khan, who in the course of an interview, told me that a lot of the received ideas of Western correspondence come from this westernized, as he put it, corrupted elite of people.
I didn't use the word corrupt.
I'm not referring to you, sorry. Imran. Unless. And I have to say I'm just always slightly wary about these labels. I think probably, frankly, most of you are part of what people may call the westernized elite. I think that, it's inevitable that foreign journalists who come here will be speaking to people, number one, who have the same language as them, number two, who have similar levels of educational attainment, number three, come from a sort of similar socioeconomic background. There is obviously a danger of being captured by that and allowing the view of a small portion of society, in Pakistan probably a smaller proportion of society than many other countries, to frame your view. But I don't think it's inconsequential either what one hears from what is called the drawing room elite, because of course the drawing room elite are the people who largely decide how things operate here. So it's important to know what they say. But equally, I would say it's also important for a reporter to get out on the ground and to test those assumptions, to test those theories, to try and find your own truth, if you like. And I suppose if I had a sort of way of working, I hope, in as much as possible, and obviously it's not possible to do this as much as one would like, is to do that, to go to the villages, to go out, and just to try and play the two things off each other. I don't think one is exclusive of the other. The other thing that seems quite obvious to me is that, the reason that you don't get a perhaps consistent view of Pakistan among foreigners or anybody who's here is that this is a deeply fragmented country, and that there is no one Pakistan. There are many, many Pakistans, and any one story, at its best, with the greatest of ambition, can really probably only hope to represent one or two of those Pakistans. In terms of Hussein's question about how do you deal with your editors if they, have a particular focus, my experience is that editors, contrary to what people often think, and now I'm speaking with reference to two newspapers that I've worked for covering Pakistan, there actually are relatively few, I know you may find this surprising, but there are relatively few received ideas about how coverage should take place. But it's often a function of, principally of the news. I mean, I'll give you an example. This week, I was earlier on today I'm trying to change a flight to go back to Islamabad earlier, because there's a Supreme Court session tomorrow. There's another issue about the ISI and the disappeared story, possibly the same day, possibly the next. There's perhaps the Osama bin Laden Commission report coming out sometime in the next week. So the point is that actually these are news events which are not generally negotiable. They are the news that needs to be covered from Pakistan. So when we want to cover the other things, for instance, one of the most enriching experiences I've had in Pakistan was reporting on the Sewan Sharif Sufi festival some years ago, which was really for me, you know, revelatory and somehow transformed my idea about how part of Pakistan worked. But you know, that was a 3-day trip, and it occurred at a time when I was able to get away. So I would humbly suggest that part of the difficulty of reporting the other side of the country is that frankly at the moment the news cycle, the turn of the news cycle is so frenzied that sometimes there isn't a lot of room for the rest. And I don't say that by way of an excuse, I just say that by way of an observation about how newspapers work.
Oh, okay. Volunteer कहाँ हैं? Mike? Hello. जी. Excuse me, I have others. वहाँ ले जाइएगा Mike, please. The lady in red. So, and I'm very sorry. We have only 10 minutes, and I know there are countless questions. So we'll have Tahira Abdullah after you, and maybe 1 or 2 from that, and that young gentleman.
There was a comment from one of the respected Indian journalists about the fact that there is similarities between India and Pakistan, but that doesn't mean that we are the same. I just needed to make a little comment and maybe ask the question. If there are similarities, definitely I think both countries, and whether it's India or Pakistan or USA or Europe or Pakistan and the rest of the world, the people, we all belong to the one human race. And when are we working towards, as journalists, towards the next evolutionary step, which is recognizing the humanness between all of us, which makes us part of the one human nation, and how and when are we working towards the realization that it's unenlightened uneducation which results in these differences, and how are we working towards an evolutionary togetherness under oneness rather than under separate nations, which
Thank you.
I think you understand.
We'll ask Alok ji later, but Tahira, माइक लेकर आइए, सबसे आखिर में जाइए जरा. आप साथ खड़े हो जाएं ताहिरा अब्दुल्ला के, उसके बाद ही आप वहाँ सवाल पूछ लें.
Thank you. Hello. I can barely hear myself.
Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Tahira Abdullah and I come from a place close to Pakistan, Islamabad. This question is addressed to all the panelists except Declan Walsh. And the question is, no, seriously. The question is, why is it that the fledgling civil society and the resistance movement in Pakistan, which is left of center, totally ignored by the international media, whether it's South Asian, Western European, North American, Australian or whatever, and a handful of mullahs will get together frothing and foaming at the mouth, and they will get front page billing or electronic media headline news billing, breaking news billing.
Okay, young, pass the mic over there to the young man. This time. Ji,
Can you hear me?
Let me take 3. I'm sorry, I have to. Ji.
Well, I think you should certainly answer her question. And I wanted to ask you about, if you could just comment on objectivity in journalism, because obviously we've covered that there. Shout it out. We've already talked about like the negative aspects about Pakistan, that sometimes it succumbs to or is subjected to a trial by media. And I was wondering if you could comment on the objectivity of journalism. Should you try to present more positive stories of Pakistan to combat the negative stories, or should you just, like, what should you do? What is objectivity in journalism now?
Okay. One more question? Ji. Why don't you just speak? Pass it.
मैं उर्दू में सवाल कर रही हूँ.
मैं आप सबसे सवाल ये है कि जब मैं अक्सर बाहर ट्रैवल करती रहती हूँ, मैंने हर जगह देखा लोग पाकिस्तान को सिर्फ और सिर्फ एक टेररिस्ट और ख़तरनाक जगह समझते हैं। क्या ये जो यहाँ आए हैं, these people who came here, do they think that this place is very scary place and the people are not welcome here? I just only want to ask
Thank
this.
you, thank you. Well, I think we'll have responses. I think, Stefan, you need to address the earlier question on the travel accounts about the...
Well, I would love to go with you to the north, anytime you like. Just take me there. I hope I get the permission from the government, but even without permission, I would dare to do so. I'm told it's dangerous, but I don't care. Nonetheless, as a travel writer, and I'm very different from the journalists represented here. As a travel writer, for me, travel writing is a self-reflective genre. So if I do a travel writing, I don't just report on the country I see, on what I see, I report also on myself. So I try to experiencing something else is also experiencing oneself. And I try to get to know what happens to myself when I travel through this country. And in order to do this, I need a rather extensive experience in traveling in that country, and I haven't got this experience so far. But the important thing for me is, if you read my travel writing, you will be surprised. For example, my travel writing on North Africa, you will learn something about North Africa, yes, but you will also learn something about how North Africa is seen by a Westerner, and what this Westerner is thinking about his seeing, and how is he questioning his own view onto North Africa, and so on and so on. So this is what interests me, but this is a different story, I think. Thank you.
We'll come to India later, but I think you may like to address Tahir Abdullah's question on why the resistance movements are not given as much weight as the mullahs.
No, I'm very sorry, but they're not given none at all, as Declan will confirm. Figures like Asma Jahangir, for example, and the movements that she has represented have been very widely reported in the Western media. And of course there is a great deal of support for such people. But the problem is that there is a mullah in every village, you know. And mullahs do run two major, though thank God not dominant, political parties, and of course the cadres, or the sort of the officer class, if you can call it that, of the Tehreek-e-Taliban is provided by people who call themselves mullahs, even if the extent of their religious education is 6 weeks in a madrasa. And of course this is a very serious rebellion and terrorist movement against Pakistan, with links to groups that threaten us. So I mean, equally we cannot, we could not possibly ignore those sides of Pakistani society. When it comes to, if I may, objectivity, briefly, then I hand over to... It is a very, very difficult one, and on the one hand, of course, we should be aware that nobody is capable of full objectivity. That's simply not a human possibility. At the same time, I have the honour to say, trained by the BBC initially, and I think the BBC does make a very serious effort, if naturally, in the end, a partially unsuccessful one, but still a very serious effort compared to many other places to instill a degree of objectivity, at least in the process by which you come to report and make decisions. I don't think it's a matter of it's not a mathematical thing of balancing one story about a threat or a disaster or a problem with one positive story about something nice. No, that's not at all the way to go, because they end up. I mean, they don't balance each other, because you'll have a nasty story about the threat from the Taliban, and you'll have a nice story about a literature festival, but it doesn't actually operate on the same plane. Rather, you need to be able to step back from the day's news, to look perhaps historically a bit more at things over time. Not to become, well, of course, the problem is the journalists on the ground don't decide the headlines, as I know to my bitter cost when I was a journalist, when I had the most ridiculous headlines clapped on stories, which actually said something completely different. But, for example, I mean, Karachi, when there are these periodic surges of violence in Karachi, it is very easy to fall into the trap of reporting that the city is getting worse and is falling into chaos. If, of course, you can look back, you can see that on occasions there were much worse episodes in the past from which the city recovered. And therefore you get a sense that, nasty as some of this may be, it doesn't, represent a linear progress down the drain, thank God. So I think that's more the point, to try to take a couple of steps back from, what can be, yes, I mean, the very alarming and worrying daily news, and put it in a wider context of history and of the country. And the other thing, of course, is it's difficult to do this because a human being by definition is in one place at one time. But as I said in my book, you can have terrible things happening in one part of Karachi, or two parts of Karachi, or even three parts of Karachi, and other parts of Karachi, nobody will know anything's happening. I had, by the way, exactly the same experience in Moscow and other great cities. So you do need also to do that, to step back and remember that this is a very, very big place. And very, very big places, I mean, Pakistan as a whole, have that bit, more capacity to absorb, even some terrible instances of violence.
I want my countrymen to respect this nation, not say that because it's a failed country, it is this, it is that. Just like I want my nation to be respected, I want this nation to be respected. It may have the same food, the same language, same everything, but I am talking about that this is what I meant. I didn't, maybe I didn't speak clearly enough. This is the whole point. I remember people saying, why did Pakistan, I said, I can't tell you the history in 2 minutes. Why did Pakistan get created? Why? I compare it to one situation, USA and Canada. For most of us sitting here, to tell an American and a Canadian apart, by their accent, by their attitudes, by everything, but they're different nations. That is my point. Here is, if this half the problem would be solved, if I said you're a Pakistani, I'm in India, I respect you for your differences and I'm happy with you for your similarities.
Alok ji.
Well, to follow up, I'd just like to say that I thought I was coming to a new country. And this country has to be, as he rightly says, respected for its integrity. And it has its problems. But its problems will have to be internally solved, and its problems with its neighbors will have to be solved through discussion and talk. The second thing I want to say is that Indian press certainly does not talk about what I have actually seen here. A certain kind of openness, a certain kind of willingness to discuss, a certain kind of energy in the newspapers, and certainly a kind of courage which I'm sure Indians would not understand is actually working by the women and the young. Women have put up an enormous resistance here to the mullahs. They have done so against the overwhelming odds. And I can only think that they deserve better press than they have got. In the women writing, for instance, from Pakistan, and I've now been seeing a lot of paintings from Pakistan by women. They're as bold, as innovative, as experimental as anything you would see in the world. And as far as an Indian goes, I would say, having traveled all around, I don't think Karachi is more dangerous than New York.
Which leads us to the question the lady asked in Urdu, that were you scared by being in Pakistan? So I think you will respond.
Yeah, most of the time, no. I'd actually just like to make one final point, if I may, raising something that was raised by Tara about this whole issue of civil society, the voices of civil society and its representation in the foreign media. I mean, I take that to be a synonym for progressive voices, people who want debate, who want change in Pakistani society. And if I may just slightly sidestep the swipe, if you like, I think what's actually, to me, a much more important issue is how that debate is taking place in the local media. You know, we have this incredibly vibrant media which is covering this event and many others, and has done really amazing and exemplary work in many fields over the last number of years. But there are some very key things in Pakistani society where I see a very stifled or a fearful or a lack of debate. Issues about the conflict in Balochistan, about the issue of blasphemy reform, of the legislation, of the, you know, the power of the military, of transparency in government and in governance. And it just seems to me, without trying to, you know, get away from the focus of what we're talking about here, that's actually at the end of the day a far more consequential debate to have.
Perfect. आप कहिए जो कहना चाहती हैं.
I just want the names of the generals who appeared on those.
Okay, I think I know that there are many other questions, but I'm sorry, we'll have to wrap up this session. Thanks to all the panelists and a very engaged audience, and I think it was a great afternoon. Thank you.
By my cynical standards.